die. He parried with Proverbs 31:4. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. Exasperated, his wife implored him, but you're never home anymore. You and your uncle are obsessed, always behind the store, always worshiping at that cursed still. It's a disgrace. With that, she stomped off in a huff, the very picture of righteous indignation. Reverend Call, however, was not persuaded to abandon his side hustle, and soon his little still was turning a real profit thanks to his uncle's experience making moonshine. In fact, it was Reverend Call's uncle who suggested they add a little color to their product by filtering the crystal clear alcohol through layers of charred sugar maple wood, a completely new technique that gave their shine a smoky aftertaste and a warm amber hue. His customers loved it, and including many from his own congregation, were hanging on every word. But then, to his great and everlasting dismay, the young firebrand pivoted from a promise of eternal salvation to a promise of eternal damnation, specifically for anyone who trafficked in hard drink. Reverend Call glanced down at his shoes and tried to ignore the stares directed in his direction, but he knew the damage was done. The following Sunday, his own congregation, egged on by his own wife, presented him with an ultimatum: resign his still or resign his ministry. It was a tough decision, but in the end, Reverend Call deferred to the wisdom of Proverbs 25:24. For it is better to live in the corner of a housetop than to share a house with a quarrelsome wife. The Reverend had no wish to lose his ministry and no desire to occupy the corner of his housetop. So he kept the peace and sold his beloved still for a song. Funny thing though, he didn't sell to his uncle, the experienced moonshiner who had put the remarkable color and taste into his whiskey. Instead, he sold his still to his 13-year-old apprentice, a child with no experience running a business, no money, and no real chance of success. Why? Because in spite of his great expertise, the Reverend's uncle was simply not qualified to own a business. In fact, the Reverend's uncle was not even his uncle. He was his property. Of course, there wasn't anything illegal about that. Reverend Call was just another guy who had purchased another human being to make life a little easier. A purchase that the Reverend's wife had not objected to, or for that matter, anyone in his congregation. And really, why would they? The Reverend had broken no law. And besides, as long as it's legal, man should be able to buy or sell whatever he pleases, right? But speaking of what's legal and what isn't, it's worth noting that prohibition is not just about limiting what we're allowed to drink. Sometimes it's about limiting what we're allowed to say. And for decades, the tour guides down there in Lynchburg were strictly prohibited from telling visitors about the slave called Uncle Nearest. Instead, they told a simpler story about the kind-hearted Reverend Call, who took a poor country boy under his wing and taught him how to make moonshine. It's a good story. It always includes mention of the gold medals the boy's whiskey would later win at the World's Fair, and the famous band he started that still bears his name, and the square bottles he insisted on using so that his customers might equate his product with the epitome of a square deal. And of course, the famous limestone cave. The cave with the underground spring that still flows with water so clean and pure it washes away the bitterness that other brands so often leave behind. Happily, that prohibition has also been repealed. And today, if you take that same tour down there in Lynchburg, you'll hear the whole story. A story that includes the contribution of Uncle Nearest Green, the slave, who taught Reverend Call everything he knew about the business of making whiskey, including the technique now known as the Lincoln County process, the filtering breakthrough that gave the Reverend's moonshine its unique color and taste. It's always nice to see credit given where credit is due, but today few people remember the slave who taught the Reverend how to make the moonshine. What we remember is the apprentice who wound up owning the still, the poor country boy whose name can be found on millions of black labels, carefully affixed to millions of square bottles. The name of a 13-year-old apprentice who used the still of a reverend and the ingenuity of a slave to create America's best-selling whiskey, an apprentice called Jack Daniel. Anyway, that's the way I